Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Thanks all of you to come back in spite of the popcorn, but I think that's a good transition to the social media session, which is headed by Kate Crawford, who is one of our social media researchers.
Thank you, Christian. I think the implication is that we're incredibly entertaining people, so I'll do my best. I think one of the really significant and powerful things about this lab is the recognition that technology is not just computer science and engineering and math. It is also social and cultural. And there's something really exciting happening right now at the intersection, in particular, of computer science and social, scientific, and humanistic methods. And I count it as a pleasure and a privilege to be working at that intersection with my colleagues in the Social Media Collective, founded by the wonderful, please stand, Dana Boyd, lovely to have you here, and joined by Nancy Baim, Mary Gray, Megan Finn, Jessa Lingle, and Kate Miltner. With this amazing group, we think about the ways in which social practices and network spaces are interrelating. And what we're going to give you today is a little bit of a tasting plate. 3 of our favorite collaborators and thinkers who make us better researchers. And what they're going to give you in quite short talks is a sense of the landscape, a little glimpse of a set of relationships between big data, algorithms, and social media with health, politics, and public space. First up, we have Gina Neff, who is a professor at the University of Washington in the Communications Department, and also the author of the very recently published excellent book with MIT Press, Venture Labor. Gina.
Today. The question that I'm asking is why big data won't cure us. Backed by Intel, we've spent the last 3 years studying data practices and contexts at the intersection of formal medicine and consumer wellness. What we found, we think, is important for understanding healthcare IT, and we think it has huge implications for understanding the social nature of data. Let me start with a quote from our research. "I want to work with a doctor who believes me." This is from Katie McCurdy. She's an activist in the quantified self movement. She's a woman with a rare autoimmune disorder that causes weakness in voluntary muscles. It's a condition that leaves her in pain and often without the ability to stand in front of an audience and smile. She's also a user experience designer, and she made this. This is a visualization of her life. Literally, it's 35 years of charting her condition and her memories and her feelings about her disease. "I want to work with a doctor who believes me." Now, this is literally from a woman who has evidence on her face. She made this chart in an attempt to communicate with her doctor. She graphically quantified the qualitative, and she hoped that her data would do something for her, that it would help her get heard. She also documents her illness over time with photographs of her smile. The artist and activist Regina Holiday turned these photographs into this mural, Quantified Smile. It's also telling. Quantified Self is going on right now as we speak on the other coast. Quantified Smile. Regina does these jackets. She paints these murals on jackets as part of a walking gallery. literally a reminder so people walking around medical conferences are reminded that we're all patients. And in that sense, we all have stories we want heard. We all want our data to be used to help us get better. And we also want our data to be heard. Before we can talk about the technical problems of health data innovation, and there are many, we need to solve some basic communication problems first. Before we can talk about the integration and analysis of multiple data sources into electronic health records, or the health intelligence possible from wearable pervasive devices, or how search analytics can be tools for health prediction, we need to figure out how these data can be used for the joint decision-making of patients with their doctors. These are the biggest problems for health data innovation, and they are social problems, not technical ones. To solve them, I argue we need to rethink data as social. O'Malley, the technology journalist, recently called for data with empathy. Now, he was writing about Foursquare and coffee shops. But I think digital health innovation is an ideal place to look for what we might start to call something like data and empathy. This talk is based on research that I'm doing with Brittany Fiore-Silfast. She's currently an intern here at MSR New England. And she will be looking for gainful employment as soon as she finishes her NSF-funded dissertation. Hire her, she's very smart. There are 3 misconceptions that we have about data that stand in the way of empathy. First, data are not resources. As I turn my page. People are looking to data to solve enormous problems in US healthcare. We interviewed frontline providers in impoverished and rural areas in the United States and India, technology enthusiasts in mobile health and IT startups, doctors and scientists in major research hospitals, quantified self-members who are tracking enormous amounts of personal data, and people at health technology conferences on both the East and the West Coast. To understand the startup world, I joined the brain trust of a business accelerator in this vertical. I don't even know what that means. We did all this to find out what people are doing with their data, what practices they have around health data, and how they talked about their data. Now, one of our key findings from this research is so obvious at first blush that it seems strange it has not been integrated into the design and implementation of health data innovation. Namely, people expect really different things from their data. They expect data work in different ways. Doctors, patients, and entrepreneurs all value data for different goals in different ways. In a new paper, Brittany and I termed these data valences, the social expectations of how data will perform, or what people think data do in social settings. Now, consider this from a gerontologist. I don't need more data. I need more resources. Saying that in Silicon Valley or Seattle is heresy. Likewise, to many of us who spend our careers cleaning, massaging, collecting, wrangling, analyzing data, we always want more of it. But to the doctor, data represent time and money. A biostatistician highlighted this difference between the culture of clinical care and medical research. Physicians are typing away madly. All that information is actually very rich. From the doctor's perspective, though, any data that doesn't contribute to a clinical decision or action is a waste of their resources and a lawsuit waiting to happen. No wonder so many doctors view data innovation as diverting resources away from patient care. Now, contrast that to the overhyped, by this point, slogan, data is the new oil. With informal medicine, data are useful resources, right? Data are useful resources only when connected to clinical decisions and actions. Now, these are two very different expectations of data. And yet, as we all know and believe, data have and present enormous potential. In the healthcare setting, data need both interpretation and connection to be useful. Or as Jen Vandermeer has recently put it in an article, data is not a business model. It's only the commodity. Action based on wisdom is the valuable resource. Now, this brings me to my second point about data. Disconnected from these social contexts and arrangements, data are not communication. We saw this in a pilot project we studied that used a relatively simple device, the Bosch Health Buddy, for chronic disease management. This was a program for elderly, rural patients who lived in sometimes 2 hours away from their doctor. Participants in the program would answer a simple set of questions every day, and this data was managed by an algorithm that presented it to a nurse and it was coded red, yellow, or green, who needed a follow-up call from the nurse. Now, using this technology, nurses were able to see 150 patients a day, right? They were able to check in on 150 different people a day. They saw them here on this desktop, and they connected to them on that phone. This is actually a picture of their Windows-based operating environment. We watched how these nurses would really do data interpretation on the fly. Pretty complex analysis where they were always adjudicating between and across variation in their cases based on their interactions, their history, the context of the patient. Consider then this quote from one of the patients about the device, the simple machine itself. "It's a machine, but it's almost like it talks to me every day, like someone cares." You see, their data didn't have to be validated with a phone call every day to make them feel like someone cared. Just knowing that the data could lead to a conversation was huge, like someone cares. Now, data are not inherently communication, but given the right setting, they can be this fantastic opportunity for those conversations and connections. Which brings me to my last point. Data are not private. This process of making data is always social. Data are meaningful only because of how someone collects, manages, and makes arguments with that data. Data is not the new oil, it's hydropower. Always made, not found. The exact wrong question to be asking today is, what are we going to do with all of this data? Well, except for all of us researchers, right? We're going to still be asking, what do we do with all of our data? The better questions, though, really are data for whom, data when, and data why. Take this image from the Collaborative Chronic Care Network, or C3N. They're a project of the Cincinnati Children's Hospital. Now, at the core of their philosophy is using data, building a data ecosystem that is meaningful, valuable, and useful for their different communities of pediatric patients, their doctors, and researchers. Here's a quote that they list on the website for inspiration. "Once you open the possibility that people are not only using the web as a platform to produce their own individual content, but you also to pool their efforts, knowledge, and resources. The possibilities for what they can create are astounding. That's from Harvard social media theorist Yochai Benkler. Data for whom, data when, and data why. Now, in addition to the social side of data, there, of course, is another way data are not private. To turn a technology axiom on its head, healthcare data never want to be free. Kate Crawford here at MSR has argued that it's really dangerous to think that large-scale data can be made anonymous, inherently objective, or come with a tacit or explicit approval, consent. She and her collaborator, Jason Schultz, are tackling the problem of predictive privacy, not direct breaches in personally identifiable information, but rather those that predictively approximate our private information with a high degree of accuracy. Security research continues to show how anonymous data can be re-identified, and in fact, LaTanya Sweeney has worked with a team that exploited well-known weaknesses in large-scale databases to link names and contact information to publicly available profiles in the Personal Genome Project. The risks for health data are simply too high to assume that data without personal identifiers can remain private. Data is not a generic off-the-shelf product. It doesn't come prepackaged, clean, and ready to use right out of the box. Our health data should not be laundry soap. It should be artisanal. Currently, we don't actually have very good bridges for data to cross the social worlds in healthcare among patients, clinicians, and researchers. Now, to do that, we're going to need real design for social settings and real practices, and I have a few ideas for how to get there. First, we need to have transparent conversations on what data actually do, as well as what people think their data are doing. People will tell us what they think is valuable about data if we listen to the valences that resonate in their communities. And when we do that, we can start to use data for their potential to build and foster those communities. Data then start to look a lot less like they belong in a generic box, and much more that they emerge from a set of relationships. This is what data with empathy looks like. It was in the C3N case, and it's here in the rural telemedicine program that we studied. This is a picture that the nursing team used in all of their presentations to show why their work with the Bosch Health Buddy was so important. It also shows one of the first patients in their study who died. Data are not communication. Ultimately, data alone won't cure us, but these cases from health technology innovators can show how data can be used to help us see each other as individuals, respect our multiple communities, and to help people tell their unique stories. Let us build the structures, platforms, applications, and communities that empower people to link data to empathy, understanding, and action. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Gina. Next up, we have one of our own, Andres Monroy Hernandez. Andres is a researcher at MSR in Redmond, but we like to claim him first because he was a postdoc here in the Social Media Collective. And Andres's work is really extraordinary for the way in which he looks at how social tools can be used to foster civic engagement and also particular kinds of creative practice. Over to you, Andres.
Thank you, Kate. core topics of my research is on collective action. And I've been looking at collective action from many different perspectives. But one of the things that I've been looking at recently is collective action through this technological form, which is hashtags. And in some ways, you can think of hashtags as ad hoc collective action. In case you know what hashtags are, hashtags are things that people add often to words on things like Twitter, Facebook, etc., to identify categories. And what is really interesting about hashtags is that these kind of emerge organically from people's practices, and these platforms have started to kind of implement mechanisms to, when you click on one of these hashtags, you see all the messages that have been tagged that way. But hashtags have become really visible in moments of crisis, and this is the kind of collective action that I've been really interested in looking at. When this collective action has to happen quickly and very ad hoc and very organically. So this is a tweet, for example, from the tsunami in Japan, obviously with some hashtags, and this is a particular message asking for help. We also see in hashtags in the, in crisis related to political events, in the Arab Spring and all sorts of different political movements, some of which we've studied. But today I want to focus on one particular kind of crisis, which is very close to me. I'm originally from Mexico, and as you probably see in the news, there is a war going on in Mexico. There's a lot of people, more than 60,000 people have been killed since the war started in 2006. But one of the interesting things about the Mexican drug war is, as opposed to the other crises, like the one I mentioned in Japan and others, people who live in these cities that are embattling the drug war are dealing with crisis as part of their everyday life. So, an earthquake is the kind of thing that you might experience one in a lifetime, or maybe twice if you're unlucky enough. But in Mexico, people are, dealing with, car bombs, grenade attacks, all sorts of crises in an ongoing basis, the same way we deal with traffic here. One of the differences between what's happening in Mexico and what we see in other places that are in crisis is that traditionally the typical way in which institutions react to crisis is you have the government officials reporting on what's going on, and then you have the media that is kind of helping broadcast those messages and bringing information to citizens. But what is interesting in Mexico is that these two institutions are not doing the role. So on the one hand, you have, for example, in this Washington Post article, how journalists are adhering to a near-complete news blackout under strict orders of drug smuggling organizations and their enforcers, who dictate via daily telephone calls, emails, and news releases what can and cannot be printed or aired. And again, this is, imagine you're a journalist in this place. Very few journalists dare, to publish things on the mainstream media because they're afraid of their lives. Similarly, the government officials are also adhering to a news blackout. And this cites the case of the city of Nuevo Laredo in the border with Texas, where the mayor mysteriously disappears for days and refuses to discuss drug violence. And even the military general who presides over the soldiers patrolling the city does not hold news conferences or issue any statements. So again, imagine you're a person living in this place. You have no information about what's going on. At the same time, in Mexico, as many other places in the world, we've seen an increase in the adoption of social media. And these, coupled with weakening institutions like the ones I mentioned, journalism and the government, and an increased violence, has led to kind of really interesting ways in which people use social media to communicate what's going on. And again, this is work that I've been doing as part of my postdoc here, as well as some colleagues in MSR in Redmond as well. So the kind of thing that I started to notice kind of anecdotally as somebody who lived in Mexico is tweets like this. And I'm going to translate this to English. And this is, caution on Gonzalez Avenue by the big supermarket. People report a recent risky situation, which is a euphemism for a lot of these kind of car bombs and grenade attacks, etc. And then the hashtag MTYfollow to refer to, you can click there and you can see what's going on in the city. So actually, if you go to Twitter right now and you look at the hashtag MTYfollow, you will see very accurately what's going on in the city of Monterey. MTY is the abbreviation for Monterey, and follow just an invitation to follow this hashtag. So we decided to look, first, the basic word frequency in one of these cities to see what is it that people are talking about. And one of the things that comes really clearly is, people are talking about the word balacera, for example, in Spanish is shooting, precaution. There's also, if you know the city, you know that, Apodaca is a location, Guadalupe is another location. So people are referring to things that are going on as well as the locations where these things are happening. Furthermore, there is also the emergence of this kind of set of words that people often refer to narco language. which we've seen also from the data. And so one of the words, for example, is encobijado, which is when they found a body wrapped in a blanket. So these are specific words that have been kind of developed to refer to all sorts of practices that these criminal organizations use. There's a bunch of other words, and we've been looking at the presence of those words across multiple cities in Mexico, looking at the data from different cities as well. And one of the interesting things is that these words are positively correlated to the homicide data that we see every month in these cities. So again, it's kind of a proxy to see what's going on in these cities. Furthermore, we decided to look at, again, those 4 cities, Reynosa, Monterrey, Saltillo, and Veracruz, and look at the frequency of these tweets. And the first thing that we notice is that those spikes that you see that actually correspond to big events. So for example, in Monterrey, the city in the second here, this big spike corresponded to 52 people killed in a casino that happened that particular day, and the same for the other cities. So again, in kind of a correspondence between what you see online and what you see on the streets. The other thing is the spread of this violence also has gone from north to south, which is the way in which these cities are ordered. Again, kind of relating to how we can perceive some of the things that are going on the streets through social media, even though we might not see that necessarily from news media. The other thing that we've been looking at is that, personally, when I've been looking at the news coming from Mexico, is that people still tweet about what's going on, but because this is going on for more than 6 years now, people are losing kind of the surprise to these events. So a lot of times people are reporting these kinds of things like, oh, yet another person hanging from a bridge kind of thing. So we wanted to see if this is represented in the data as well. And we, sure enough, found that there is increased violence, increased numbers of homicides, but there is lower negative affect in the tweets. And the same, well, the opposite for dominance and activation, which Eric referred to from the work that they've been doing with postpartum depression. We use the same techniques. In fact, Moon de Chowdhury is one of my collaborators in this. And basically, this speaks to some of the literature on affective desensitization, how these 3 phenomena occur when this happens. The other thing that we were interested in looking at is like who is reporting these things. And we decided to plot the people reporting posting these messages across 2 axes: number of tweets that they posted and number of followers that they have. And what we found is, you have like 3 different categories of individuals. You have people over there with lots of followers, more than 1 million followers, but very few tweets. And then people in the center and people over there. And here, the people over there are people like CNN, for example. So they have a lot of followers, and they report on all sorts of things, not only about Mexico. But when they do report about Mexico, they often use these hashtags that have organically been created by the community. And then you have people like average citizens who happen to be passing by or seeing some kind of violent event, and they use the hashtags to report. And then you have these other individuals who don't have as many followers as CNN, but they do have a lot of followers. And they also produce a lot of content. And when you look at what they do is they often receive messages from other people, and they kind of curate them. And then when they receive multiple messages about the same event, they kind of broadcast that back to their followers. So if you want to know what's going on in the cities, you can either go to the hashtag or follow these individuals, and they're acting really as journalists. And the same, if you look at the retweet network in these cities, you notice the same pattern where these individuals are the same ones that I showed over there in the previous slide. So we decided to actually talk to these people. Obviously, as you can imagine, it's really hard to talk to them. These are fake names, but I talked to a couple of them, and these are just two women that I talked to who performed this role of curator. And one of them, Angela, has about 25,000 followers when we talk to her, and Claudia has about 30,000 followers. And when I asked them, for example, how many hours a day do you spend doing this work, Angela said that she spends about 15 hours a day, reporting these events. So you can see that they really are doing this pretty much all day. The other thing that I asked her, how do you see your role? So for Angela, she said, I am a journalist. It is as if I was a war correspondent on social networks of the war we are living in Mexico. So I thought it was really interesting, the way she referred to herself as a war correspondent. For Claudia, she says, I'm yet another citizen, but people do think of me as an angel, as she said. So oftentimes people will, check with her whether the road to go from home to work or vice versa is safe to navigate. The other thing that is really interesting about this phenomena is that these individuals and people reporting things online are being targets of intimidation, both by governments and cartels. And I'm just going to mention 2 cases. There is one that happened in 2011, I believe. In September 2011, of these two individuals who were involved in retweeting some messages in the state of Veracruz, and turns out that some of the messages that they were retweeting were false, or at least that's what the government claimed. So they were sent to jail on charges of terrorism for spreading misinformation on social networks. But again, it's really hard to know in these places what's misinformation and what's not, given that there is not like a, the journalists are not really reporting what's going on. So the governor of Veracruz, which is the state where this happened, changed the law to make it illegal to report information that might terrorize others on social networks, and that's still active. The other kind of intimidation is from cartels themselves. As you can imagine, they might not be really happy with this. Although I have to distinguish it in two types of things that people do online. There are some people who report things that are public, like these shootings, which typically cartels don't really mind that much. In fact, sometimes they like it. It's kind of like publicity for what they do. But in other cases, they report on private information. And this is what leads to things like this. So these are two people hanging from a bridge after reporting things on social media, or at least that's what the banners that they were left next to their bodies said. So again, the cartels, going after people who might be reporting private information. So kind of going back and trying to analyze a lot of this data, one of the things that I was trying to see is whether this happens in other places as well. And I don't know if you remember, for those of you who live here in Cambridge, about a year ago, there was a shooting here in Kendall Square. So I went online to Twitter again and see whether people were reporting things. And sure enough, I found a lot of people reporting things even before the Cambridge Police Department or the news media was reporting anything. And one of the interesting things that I found is that there is this account, Alert New England, that actually performs this role of curation of information. And this person, I talked to this person on Twitter, Steve, and I asked him, where do you get the information? And he basically spends a lot of time listening to the police scanner here in Boston and reporting things on Twitter right away. But what is interesting is that you can see this individual reported back to this account with an image of what this person has just seen. And I think it's maybe from this building, actually, looking at that view. So basically, like, not only this person is reporting what's going on, but they also gaining so much visibility that they have, other individuals sharing data and images and media, etc. But one of the interesting things about this, and this I just put it in Storyfy, I don't know if you're familiar with this tool. It's a tool that allows you to manually curate, and put together a story in the form of a feed of what's going on. So you can do this, and this is a tool that was developed for journalists. But it has to be done manually, and it's only one person, in this case it was me, who put together this kind of feed. So we were interested in seeing whether there are more kind of automatic ways of doing this. So we recently released this tool for Seattle. We haven't extended to other cities that makes it automatic to to make latent content that is hyperlocal content about different neighborhoods of Seattle more visible, and doing this automatically. So if you go to WhoLeadNet, it's an app, it's a web app for mobile phones. You can select your city, only cities around Seattle, and you can select your neighborhood, and you can see what's going on, kind of in a form that is aggregated to see, what's going on in your neighborhood and so on. And one of the interesting things about this is that, a lot of this information is typically in the form of feeds, like I showed before, which I think is fine for reading quick information, especially about things that you already know about. But if we really know, if we really want to know things about, perhaps some phenomena that we don't know a lot about, like some earthquake somewhere else, typically Wikipedia is a really good place to get a more contextual kind of view of what's going on. So you get like the who, where, what, and you get a lot richer kind of information. Unfortunately for us, Wikipedia only reports on things that are notable. So it's really important for Wikipedians to report things that are already proven to be right by the media. They cannot really create an article about something that is just happening without any report from CNN or New York Times, etc. So I think the model of Wikipedia works really well. Unfortunately, it doesn't really work for hyperlocal information or things that are changing all the time, like the case of Mexico. So this summer, we started to look at this issue, and we looked at like the kind of importance or the number of people who might be interested in a particular set of news. So you have things that are kind of notable, at least from some media, and then things like just my tweet of what I was doing a few days ago, and there's a lot in between. So you have things like like the Seattle Times, for example, reporting on fireworks in Seattle. It's relevant to maybe only people who live in Seattle, but it's on mainstream media. But there is a lot in between. And a lot of this is often, or could be, kind of curated and put together in some form using a lot of different tools that are available. So what we were interested in doing, and actually we did this with Nate Matias this summer, one of our interns, we looked at, is there a way to kind of aggregate a lot of this information in a manual way, but not only with information that is already on the media, but in fact information that might be on social media, and kind of put it together in the style of Wikipedia, but using sources like the style of Storify from social media. So we've been playing with this, and it's a tool that is available for beta testing. And again, this tool basically allows communities to collaboratively create stories in a very structured way and put together kind of a Wikipedia style of story, not a feed, but an article, where not only you can start writing this together, but also ask other people to help. So here is me, hey Nate, can you contribute an image? And then Nate says sure, and then he uploads an image. Perhaps Nate is at the place where this is happening. So we've been playing with this for the past few months, and more recently, one of the things that we're exploring is to, there are a lot of scenarios where there is no one around that event, or at least no one that you know. You might want to write an article, but you don't know anyone who is, attending this bike parade or whatever. So what we've been exploring is the possibility of outsourcing this to kind of crowd workers. So we've been replacing some of these individuals with TaskRabbit. I don't know if you're familiar with TaskRabbit. TaskRabbit is a tool similar to Mechanical Turk in Amazon, but instead of doing virtual tasks, you can do physical tasks in the physical world. So you can pay somebody to go right now to the Boston Common and take a photo of something or interview someone. So that's what we've been doing with TaskRabbit. So we know there's going to be an event somewhere in Seattle, for example. It could be anywhere where the TaskRabbit is available. And we ask them, please go there and take a photo and then put it on Newspad, or go there and interview someone, and so on. So our hope is that not to replace this kind of community-driven news, but to kind of bootstrap it in the cases where we don't really have anyone there, or perhaps there might not be enough interest. But the hope is that through crowdsourcing this kind of news, we might show the possibilities of these kinds of tools and perhaps engage others in a more volunteering fashion. So with that, I want to close it, and thanks, Kate. Yeah.
Thanks, Andres. And last up, we have Tarleton Gillespie. Tarleton is a professor at Cornell. He is the author of Wildshot, and certainly from our perspective as a group of researchers, we find his work incredibly informative when we're thinking about the politics of platforms. Thanks, Tarleton.
Thanks. So I can't help but comment a bit on, I want to echo something that Kate said at the beginning about how important it is, I think at least for the social scientists in the room, that this part of the project that MSR New England represents is incorporated into the space. It's actually part of this project. It's not something that happens after the fact. It's not something that researchers are encouraged to include. It's actually a part of it. I think this panel is a really nice glimpse of the kinds of things that we can do. So we have Gina's work saying, let's see how these things land. Let's see how they fit into people's lives. We can take Andreas's work and say, what can we know about this process by examining how people take up technology, and then how can we intervene? Really powerful. And then there's a third one that I think I'll be trying to do, which is kind of like, how do these systems come to be? Part of being a sociologist of technology, the premise is that technologies are not just what are built, what are engineered, right? There's a lot of work that goes on beyond the material design of the technology. How is it framed? How is it governed? How is it sold? How is it taken up? And the argument of a sociologist of technology is that all of that is the technology too. Because when I go to bing.com to search, I'm not just using an algorithm. I'm using an offer. I'm using a resource. I'm using something that's culturally meaningful. I'm using something that I've encountered before. I'm using something that someone told me was great or awful or whatever. And all of that stuff is part of the phenomenon, right? So part of studying IT is studying all of these processes that make the technology what it is. And that's part of what I want to do today. There was a great, I wanted to comment the other way is to think about it, is that Hannah had that great quote about engineers, computer scientists want to go for the needle in the haystack, but social scientists want to observe the haystack, right? I want to add a feature to that because I don't recognize myself in that. Some social scientists want to say, a haystack? Really? Where did a haystack come from? Why a haystack exactly? Who put a haystack here? What about hay bales? Why is it in the barn? Why is it in my way? What is it doing, right? And that's one of the ways that we get to not just observe, but we get to perturb a little bit. So I'll put that in there. OK. So here's one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot is how online social media platforms, and I mean that in the broadest sense, thinking about Twitter and Facebook and YouTube, thinking about Flickr, thinking about search engines, all the sort of sites that offer up all of the things that we're saying. That they are becoming, or perhaps always have been, the keepers of online public discourse. And that role, just like being a publisher of a newspaper, just like being a head of a broadcast network, is increasingly a position where, while you are a private organization, you are also making the space and making the terms for what public conversation looks like. And one of the interesting things that happens in that job is the decision on what to remove. Right? So I find it very interesting to think about how these sites set policies, how they envision themselves as arbiters of what is appropriate and inappropriate, and especially how they develop mechanisms and how they decide on those mechanisms and enforce those mechanisms for how they patrol these sites. Now, it may look like I'm looking at a very small needle in a very small haystack, but I think if we open up this feature, it will help us see all of the kind of governance that goes on in these sites. The feature is the ability to flag, to report inappropriate content. This is becoming a ubiquitous and common, mundane element of many platforms. Most social media platforms now offer some way to flag or report. That mechanism is usually at the point of content, the video you're watching, the tweet you're reading, the blog post, the comment, what have you. And it's increasingly emerging as one of the main solutions to the problem of how do we manage the amount of stuff that's going on these social media platforms and the ability to patrol for things like pornography, hate speech, excessive violence, harassment, spam, self-harm, comments about suicide, drug use, underage activity, copyright infringement, right? An immense list of things that these sites have decided that they're supposed to sort of guard against. The question we can ask is, despite this thing becoming mundane and tiny and small, what if we unpacked this thing? What if we looked at the work it really does? Not just technical work, but social and political work. I want to highlight the fact that much of what I'm offering up here is coming out of a paper that, that I wrote with Kate Crawford. So we are both implicated in this discussion. And so flag us if we do, I don't know. I can't make a flag joke. Okay. So flagging, I almost thought, I've decided which one to check, and then I was like, no, I'm not going to do that. So flagging, I want to argue, serves two purposes. The first purpose is this is a relatively logical solution to the problem of scale. So if you are a broadcast network operator, you're going to look at 30 pilots and run 4. You can look at all of them before they go up, right? But if you're running YouTube, that's an immensely difficult thing to do, right? So instead of saying we're going to preview all of this stuff, you instead say we're going to use our community, we're going to outsource this effort, this first line of defense, right? We're going to crowdsource it basically and say, let the community tell us what we need to look at and we need to review. So it's a practical solution. At the same time, it's a powerful form of legitimation. So it's a very powerful thing to say, we listen to our community guides us as to what's appropriate and inappropriate, right? And we're responsive to them first and foremost. That's not just a nice promotional thing to say. It becomes very important when, say, a government starts to say, we should legislate your content, and we say, no, no, we have that handled, right? And community standard and public interest, these are very familiar terms that work very well inside of a policy environment. Okay. So as we started to unpack this flag to sort of draw attention to it, there were first a couple things that we wanted to look at, right? The first is that the flags, for the most part, work on a very limited vocabulary. They have a very narrow bandwidth. So let's think about the implications of that first. So in many sites, the flag is literally a binary, right? You can click the binary and you can say, I have flagged this content. Some of these sites have very little follow-up. I'm going to stop there for a second. You can click report abuse. You can say you've done this. You can submit. Very simple process. Increasingly, we see more and more of these sites adding these kind of submenus. You click the flag, and once you click it, what you get is a list of what's wrong with it, right? Inappropriate content, violence, spam, harassment. Each one of these sites has kind of a slightly different way of articulating this, but a similar idea, right? Give us a bit of information. You tick off the one that it represents. You click submit. Sometimes they say thank you, and that's the end of the experience. Right. YouTube has probably gone farthest, probably not surprising. They've got a set of submenus, right? So once you click this, you get a second submenu. You choose which thing. They just recently added a text box where you can explain, kind of explain your other answer. And you can even indicate a timestamp. So if somewhere in the video is the particular offense, you can indicate where that is, right? 500 characters, so make sure you compress your comment. So one thing is that even though we've seen an expansion of the vocabulary of what you can say, I want to argue in a minute that it's still a very limited vocabulary. Here's a second point, which is you know very little about the process once you click submit, right? So you've flagged the content or flagged the picture or flagged whatever. You've told it what category you think it falls into. You've said submit. It says thank you. And then your experience in most cases is done with this. You don't know what happens next. You don't know what that process is. You don't know how fast it is. You usually don't know the result unless you happen to obsessively check that piece of content and maybe see it went down or maybe see it didn't, right? Facebook has just recently added a feature where not only can you flag on all sorts of things, on people and images and groups, but they have a support dashboard. So all your flags are registered, and you'll get a report if you check that dashboard or through your Facebook email that says, this has been addressed, we have decided not to take it down, or we decided to take it down. But this is an exception. So in most cases, there's zero follow-up. So despite the expansion, right, the recent expansion of the vocabulary, and despite the recent addition in Facebook about a kind of follow-up monitoring, this is a very narrow vocabulary for managing the myriad of concerns that might exist on the side of users and the information that gets back to the platform and the operators of it. So for instance, there is very little way to express degree or character of your concern. There is very little room, if any, to express, to take issue with the rules. There is very little room, in most cases no room, to have a social engagement around this issue, right? A debate about what's wrong with it. And if you think about it this way, there's no alternative flag, right? So imagine you see something that you find offensive, but you also think, this should probably stay because it belongs here, because I believe in robust and sometimes troubling public discourse. There's no button with that, right? There's no yes flag. So it speaks almost entirely in a vocabulary of complaint, right? When you click that flag, it basically is an utterance that's something like, this doesn't belong here. And sometimes it's, this doesn't belong here, and I think it's porn, right? That's about what you can articulate. So, and if this seems nitpicky, remember that this flag is basically just the buttonification of what could be an email link, right? They could do all the other things the flag does. It could know which video it was referring to. It could timestamp it. It could do all those things. You might have a link that says complaint, ? And it's a link that opens up an email box that goes to YouTube or goes to Facebook. Right? That already has it built in. This was on this day. It was video X, right? You coming from user Y. But instead, we've reduced that ability to a very narrow, and I would argue datafied, right, mechanism. Offering up those, that sequence of categories is not just helping you specify what you find troubling. It's not just giving them a tip on how to move through this complaint quicker. It also gives them data, right? In their categories. Usually those categories match the sort of guidelines the site has set. And it gives them data that they can assess, right? Where are these complaints coming from? Where are our most problematic categories? So it urges our communication to them, our expression of concern, into a very constrained form, a very sort of low bandwidth form. Okay. Go to sleep. Now, all of this presumes that a complaint that one gets when they get a flag is an individual and genuine expression of concern, right? Now, that would be a relatively naive assumption, and of course, the sites that deal with this don't assume that either. But the mechanism would like to think that. I was offended, I was genuinely offended, I clicked the flag to indicate such. The reality is there are all sorts of reasons why people flag. They might be flagging because they are trying to annoy the person who made the content. They might be flagging as a kind of release valve. They might be offended by it, but they don't actually think it's against the rules. They don't know the rules, right? So all of these individual reasons why you might flag. Publicity. There have been some accusations about music videos that were racy being flagged by their publicists so that they would maybe get banned, right? So that then they could talk about how hot they were. That all of these mechanisms nevertheless become a flag. This person flagged at this time for this video, right? And reduces all of that complexity. The second, as we've seen, I don't know why Brittany's getting a lot of name checks in this panel. So Brittany Fiora-Silfast wrote an excellent article about a project called Operation YouTube Smackdown. This was a group that was active from 2007 to as late as 2011. And they were finding and highlighting Muslim fundamentalist videos, urging their followers to systematically flag them under the promotes terrorism submenu of extreme violence under YouTube. They had a video a day Twitter feed so that everyone would be sort of flagging the same video on the same day. They had a sort of ring of websites that sent this information around. And this is not the only example, right? This is just one sort of prominent example. This group thought of themselves as engaging in cyber war, right? A kind of civilian defense initiative, right? What was the phrase? Brittany had this thing. It was countering the cyber jihad one video at a time, right? So a very sort of militaristic, very organized effort, and announcing their triumphs, right? When Al-Qaeda groups acknowledged that their videos were not getting through, they served up that news that they had had effect on here. Now, you might think about this as a kind of flaw in the system, right? Boy, what a limited flag this is. You can't get any of that across. That must be bad. You might think of it as the cost of doing business. If you're going to monitor this many videos or this many tweets, you have to take a very sort of desiccated, narrow form. We argue that this ambiguity is actually quite important for platforms, right? So having a limited information on what a flag represents, having limited information about how people's offense was registered, why they were doing things, allows two things. One, it allows platforms to engage in ad hoc decisions. They can decide when to listen to those flags. They can decide when to ignore those flags. And they can use different justifications. If they're removing something based on a flag, they can say, our community spoke, right? And we listened to them. They found something horrific. We adjudicated it, and they were right. When they decide not to remove something, they can say, look, we understand that people found this offensive, but this video was publicly relevant. This was important journalism. This was troubling but necessary, right? And when they, each of these become a kind of legitimation point where they can say the flag speaks for us or we speak despite the flag. Right? This kind of ambiguity, not having to respond to or deal with the kind of information that a richer form would offer, is actually strategically valuable for them. Okay. Let me just skip this little slide. Okay. Our paper ends with an idea that Kate had where we explore what it would look like to have something like a sort of Wikipedia discussion page behind each piece of content. What if that were the kind of mechanism where you reported, where the person who produced the video could speak to it, where you could adjudicate it? It's not a perfect system, but it at least raises some of the issues about what that narrow form means and what it means that we've come to rely on it. I want to go in a different direction just for today, which is to say that in some ways, the vocabulary that this flag represents has itself become a contested space, right? So we ask this question: can the flag as a form bear the weight that we need it to bear, right? Can this little thing, can this tiny little mechanism that adding to a platform is tiny, right? It's a modular little piece of software. It exists. It's easy. It's accepted. Can it bear the weight of needing to patrol the site, placate users, demonstrate good governance, and in the face of the bitterest tensions going on today, terrorism, rape and misogyny, suicide, bullying, right? Is this the mechanism that we need? Twitter recently was dealing with the fact that a woman who had been speaking up in the UK, they were thinking about who to add to the currency, and she had said there need to be more women. There was a discussion about putting Jane Austen on the currency. That was decided to be, that was decided, and then she began to get rape and death threats all through Twitter. And it wasn't just from one person, so it was very hard to deal with as harassment. She was a public figure. It was hundreds of people. And Twitter struggled with this and talked about what they would do. In the end, they said, we'll add a flag. We didn't have a flag tweet by tweet, now we do. Right? Is that enough? Can it carry the weight? Right? We're increasingly we're using these spaces to contest these heated issues. In a very sort of interesting moment, in 2000, let me get the date, in 2008, Senator Lieberman sent a very public letter to YouTube and Google saying, I've identified these 80 videos. He believed they were Muslim fundamentalist training videos. And he said, you've got to remove this is horrific. And YouTube had a very interesting reaction. They took some of them down. They didn't take all of them down. They issued a statement about how they defend free speech while they took half the videos down. And then that's when they added promote terrorism as one of the submenu spaces, right? So that became part of our vocabulary, right? That was the response. Now we can think about the vocabulary as a place where the names of what we find most offensive, the categories for understanding what we're struggling with, are being articulated. Here's the last thought. Is it that when I flag a video because I think it's violent, and when Operation YouTube Smackdown sends that video around in their tweet and flags it, and when Senator Lieberman sends a letter, are we all in some ways flagging? Although Senator Lieberman has quite different resources to do so. Are we all enacting that same dynamic that has been built in, right? The vocabulary of complaint, both YouTube's ability to distance itself and its obligation to respond as a sort of community mechanism. Is that the structure of oversight that we've engineered? Okay, stop there, thanks.
Well, if I could just invite all of the speakers up for just a short session of questions before we wrap up. Got everybody getting remiked. Questions, yeah. We have one at the back. Jessa, please.
Yeah, thanks. So I think that, yeah, so the question was, yeah, paraphrase. Is there a way to think of a parallel between flagging inappropriate discourse and sort of historic tactics about flagging people for being inappropriate, for violating social norms or crimes or whatever? I think the key difference is that part of what is interesting and problematic here is how invisible the flagging is, right? So part of that, branding someone, literally branding someone, is a kind of like, we're going to make this violation visible on you to your community, right? And I think one of the things that people have struggled with here is that not only is the complaint sort of drop into a hole, right? It now belongs to Flickr or belongs to Twitter or whatever, but also even the process by which it's resolved is often invisible. Twitter's been making some different policies about that when they're asked to take something down from a legal perspective, trying to emphasize a kind of transparency. This has been removed and the letter goes up. But I think that's still unusual across its colleagues. So I mean, it's an interesting comparison, but I think the key is almost the commitment to invisibility as opposed to the clear commitment to visibility in the examples that you're talking about.
And we just have a question here at the front.
Yeah, thank you very much. I also want to comment on the flagging. In that, all the examples you brought up, like YouTube, Twitter, these are mainstream media sites that come out of the United States of America. And maybe we could have a more complete picture if we look at subculture. You mentioned this is offensive, but maybe there's a place here. Looking at 4chan, I know that I have a flagging because someone isn't allowed there. What about if you have, you know, what you mentioned at the end, have a discourse around appropriateness, like you have the Wikipedia discussion pages, and so maybe you get a broader signal on what is considered and what's flagged up.
Yeah, I think it was. I think it started with a kind of needing to recognize that this form, which has become quite common, and not just on social media platforms, but on, journalism, comment sequences, and smaller social media sites. It can be built into a Ning. It can be built into all sorts of mechanisms. So the widespreadness of this very desiccated one, I think we try to point out that Wikipedia has a kind of discussion environment that's quite different. Reddit handles these things quite differently in the sense that there's a lot more discussion about, right? That 4chan does a lot through, Dana and I were just talking about this, through sort of social shaming and social norms. So it's not as if this is a sort of one size fits all, but at the same time I think a clear case can be made that this format and how it's generally managed as a relatively small feature to solve this problem is widespread and is getting held up as the solution that proves that we're doing something, right? And the solution that's going to manage an archive of this scale.
Next question here, just Beth, thanks.
So I wanted to pose a question actually I think that might connect to all of the talks, which is understanding what it means for data or these digital little bits to replace human communication or substitute it. So you were talking about how the older adults felt connected even if they were a dashboard of 150 patients. And we've seen the same thing. We've seen pervasive monitoring technologies resulting in an older adult saying she felt less lonely because there was this sense of this connection because there was enough action on the other end of that to provide a reassurance. So we're taking these tweets and these monitoring technologies and these flags and they're replacing what would have previously been face-to-face or maybe pick up a telephone and talk to an individual. It both seems incredibly powerful and incredibly shallow or maybe fragile. So what kind of reinforcement is necessary for these things to feel like it's not about the technology, but I'm actually connecting with another human being?
Can I jump in? It's a great question. So briefly, to state the question back, what's the balance between people feeling connected through their data and people having a really shallow experience? And I actually think that that's something that needs to be built into the core of the design. So a recent study that I saw presented looked at young male smokers in Quebec in a smoking cessation program. And it was by text, right? So simple communication. They would, simple algorithms that would give the participants back a text in response to something they text. And the participants were told, well, you know this is basically a robot that's going to text you. And 75% of the participants texted back, thanks for the advice, that was exactly what I needed to hear. So, you know, the people in the program we studied felt connected because they were actually made to feel connected in the program, right? They knew the nurses, they talked to the nurses. The nurses worked very hard to integrate that data into plans of care for the doctors, the patient's doctors. So, you know, I think, you know, part of the story would be, yes, there are ways to automate, aggregate information, but we need to remember that if we create designs to help people be a part of a community and act with that data responsibly, then we end up with something that's much more powerful. We create an opportunity, not a replacement for communication.
But I mean, just to add a feature to that, like, wouldn't it be, it's easy, but I worry too easy to sort of say the move to data equals the move to dehumanization, right? And in sub-audiences, we need to say that because there's kind of like an enamored to the data's the solution to everything. But you know, what if we thought of it as we've always had a tension between proceduralization and sort of ad hoc human interaction, right? So that moment when we walk through the DMV and we feel like we were just a number and we feel like we got the canned response, that's a dehumanizing moment too that didn't require any data necessarily. It required algorithms, but they were algorithms about like, what do I do first? What do I do if you ask for this? What do I do with whatever? I send you to form 17, I send you to line 12. And we have that tension where, like, if we want to do the human interaction, it takes longer. It's harder to train. It's, you know, and so all the benefit we get about proceduralization gets a scale and scope and, you know, insights across many situations. And that's a human proceduralization and a computational proceduralization. Now, with powerful computational tools, we're moving into a realm where you can't do the other one, right? So if you're talking data on the tens of millions, there's not much of an alternative in the sort of humanized version. So that's why it feels like it's one and the same. But I almost think that kind of proceduralization is key to what the data commitment is, and that's the thing that we've struggled with already about human connection. And sometimes we get value out of an inhuman connection. I mean, that's what's weird too, right?
That makes us qualitative neo-institutionalists.
Really?
And on that fantastic note, thank you so much for being part of this session. If you could please thank our speakers. I'll move to afternoon tea.